And all right, to kick off, so brilliant members of our CanWaCH's Gender Equality Working Group will present on 4 practical resources today. Elizabeth Dyke will kick off our session by speaking to the guidance note on measuring women's empowerment in the global health sector. And she will also speak to the technical guidance note on developing monitoring and evaluation plans for global health and rights programs. This guidance note is hot off the press as it was just released on Friday. Elizabeth will then pass the mic to Dominique La Rochelle and Geneviève Nemou, who will dive into the Francophone Gender Lexicon. A small but mighty subgroup of the Gender Equality Working Group has been working on this guidance over the past year, and we are really excited for you to learn more about it. Just a note to say that this document is not yet released. We are working hard to have it come your way in the coming months, so please do keep an eye on the CanWaCH newsletter for that news. You will not want to miss it. And to wrap up the hour, I will quickly touch on the Beyond the Binary guidance note. And this guidance note was released last May 2021. And this guidance note dives into the inclusion of LGBTI people in development activities and is a really useful tool for practitioners. And just a note to say that all of these resources can be found on CanWaCH's website in our Learning Center. So please do take a look. They're very easily accessible, and we will be sharing the links today throughout the presentation. All right, so I will turn things over to you, Elizabeth, to kick us off. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you very much, Erica. Pleased to be here. I want to, as Erica talked about, I'm going to talk about 2 guidance notes today. I'm going to be doing my presentations in English. I'm going to just share my screen, and I will be sharing the English versions of these. They're also available in French. So I'm sure the links will be available in the chat as well. So I'm going to first talk about the Measuring Women's Empowerment guidance note, and then I'll talk about the monitoring and evaluation one. I'm going to spend a few minutes walking through each one and highlighting a few components. But to start, I wanted to just mention a few notes that we always have challenges in developing these guidance notes to keep them short, but also really relevant to the reader. And as you can imagine, people have varying range of familiarity in these different areas. People are experts, and so some of the guidance will be too simple for them. Other people are very new to these areas, so they might want to look deeper into some of the resources and references. So we really tried to balance the different audiences. And these are also both living documents. So as we know, things can change really quickly with best practices. So if you have any comments on the documents as you go through them in more detail, you can contact CanWaCH with these as well. So first, to talk about the women's empowerment one, to give a bit of background on this note in particular, in 2020, CanWaCH conducted consultations with 15 subject matter and monitoring and evaluation experts via email and through virtual meetings. And then in August, the Metrics Working Group discussed various key issues around empowerment measures, and then it went to the Metric Working Group and the Gender Equality Working Group to discuss empowerment in smaller groups. And then there was a webinar that followed. So there was quite a process ahead of my involvement in this. CanWaCH developed a draft guidance note. And then when I came on board to do some more work on this, I did a more systematic review of the academic and gray literature. And I also gathered feedback from global affairs colleagues as well, and developed this updated version of the note. And there was also a couple more consultations following that with various civil society organizations and academics, as well as global affairs when finalizing it. So you can find more information on the methods, including search terms for the literature, in Appendix A of the guidance note, and also on CanWaCH's website, where you find the guidance notes in both French and English. There's also a document that outlines a bit of the consultation process as well. So when we were developing this, there was a number of areas that people would like more information on that just were outside of the scope of the work, including more details on empowerment specifically for adolescent girls. They're certainly mentioned in this, but there's, I think that could be a whole guidance note in and of itself. And also, while gender-based violence is mentioned in the note, certainly more work could be done in that area as well. So just to highlight a few areas of the guidance note. First, the objective of this guidance note is to support measurement of women's empowerment in global health initiatives, particularly those projects that are included as part of the Canada's 10-year commitment to global health and rights. And the audience is really NGOs, Global Affairs Canada, other stakeholders also that are adhering to GAC's gender equality policies and the results-based management methodology. And the information that's in this guidance note, and it's the same with the other guidance note as well, is really intended to be used in conjunction with other documents provided by Global Affairs and others. So you'll see many references throughout this note, as well as at the end for people who may want additional information. And so to start, we kick off by talking about why measuring women's empowerment in global health is important. And I'm sure everybody on this call knows exactly why, but really this information talks about the research as well as how this relates to GAC's requirements and global commitments as well. We get into as well definitions and concepts around women's empowerment. And as I'm sure many of you know, one challenge in the literature is there isn't a common definition of women's empowerment. But Kabir's definition here in the purple box is the most often cited, and it has the 3 elements of resources, agency, and achievements. And also, we found in the review that definitions and conceptual models have many commonalities, including the understanding that women's empowerment is multifaceted, complex, and nonlinear, and it's also both a process and an outcome. So we've also included a number of resources around feminist monitoring and evaluation as well for more information here from various sources that people can get into more detail. We then get into some considerations in terms of measuring women's empowerment, and we know there are multiple domains of women's empowerment that are related to health, and that including, the bulleted list here, but decision making in the home, reproductive decisions, nutrition, economic empowerment, all of these are critical, and you may be obviously measuring across many different domains. And then we also talk about context and women's empowerment being context specific. So the local context needs to be considered, as do intersectional considerations. You also need to think about your target populations. And we get into some of these intersectional considerations. And you also need to take into account, obviously, that we know as practitioners in this area that changes like this take time. And so it's important to look at measures at the immediate, intermediate, and longer term outcomes as well. We also then get into some of the sample scales and indices that have been tested and validated to measure empowerment, depending on your context that you might be measuring empowerment. So there's a list here that you can refer to. And then we get into the limitations and challenges. And we know, as you will be well aware, that many indicators for women's empowerment are not validated, and that's a major challenge. On the other hand, too, you want to be using measures that are relevant to your context. So that can be a challenge, too, because that's going to change depending on the context that you're in. We also have a section here on the demographic health survey data in terms of some of the challenges around this use of this data. And then talking about mixed methods and the importance of mixed methods, although we also know from the literature and we hear also in a lot of feedback that qualitative indicators are oftentimes the biggest challenge as well. So next, the note gets into the guidance itself in terms of steps in measuring women's empowerment, starting off by talking about theories of change. And there's also more information in the appendix where you can, if you're not familiar with theories of change, I know a lot of us are, but depending on the person who's looking at this note, they can find more information there. But getting into using multiple validated measures where possible, measuring across socioecological levels, for example, at the individual, institutional, and policy levels, making sure that you're planning for the use of the data. So some considerations here. And you'll see oftentimes throughout the note, there's also links that you can click on to get to Global Affairs Canada documents that can be helpful to be able to provide more information as well. Then there's specific examples in the note. We found that we tried where possible to give specific examples for people. So there's examples on ultimate outcome level measures, intermediate outcome level measures, and immediate outcome level measures, and also output levels, so that you can see some examples there as well. And again, some more resources from Global Affairs Canada that you might be able to use to be able to develop these too. And then following with more examples, looking at page 16 and 17, you'll see a chart actually with intermediate and immediate outcomes by various domains. You have the outcome level, the change itself, the domain, an indicator example, and then methods and sources. And these are worked on with Global Affairs Canada, so hopefully give you some really specific examples that you can use in terms of development of your indicators. And so there's quite a few there with some more reference detail that you can look into. So again, trying to provide some really concrete information for you to be able to use. Then we get into some of the other areas to consider around data collection methods and frequency of data collection, and also ethics considerations that you may want to consider. And we'll talk a bit more about ethics in the other note as well. And then a bit more information on qualitative data collection methods, again, an area where people oftentimes struggle in terms of trying to think about what kind of indicators we might be able to develop in this area. I just noticed in the chat that someone was asking about the PDF. These are all available online, so I'm just walking through these. I think the link will be available there, so I'm just walking through what's already available online. So then we get into more concrete examples in terms of results chain examples, and again, these are developed with Global Affairs Canada as well. So looking at different outcomes across ultimate, intermediate, immediate, and output, different indicators, and then identifying data source, data collection methods, and frequencies. So again, some specific examples that you might be able to pull from for results chain examples. And then at the end, we have a checklist. So the checklist is really based on the previous areas of the note to be able to have you walk through some of the various considerations when you're measuring women's empowerment to a summary really of what's been covered. So including the theory of change, the different domains, were these co-created, how were these co-created, how were they validated, have you adapted them to the context, are they across different levels, are you using multiple measures, is the data disaggregated, what about other related indicators, multiple sources and mixed methods, and then data use for learning and performance. Then there's quite a bit of information also in the appendices, again, for people who want more detail. So the Appendix A really covers the methods that we use to develop the guidance note, including the literature search that I did in terms of the gray and the academic literature. There's also a list of the academic references that were included in the review. And then a list of the gray literature that's included in the review if you want to get into more detail. A list of some external measures, tools, and manuals. So again, if you want to do more of a deep dive into what others are doing in this area, and these are organized also by, for example, adolescent empowerment or around theories of change. So people who may be more new to these areas or people who may want to find out more information in more detail. And then also a listing of the various global affairs documents that may be helpful as well. So this has really been, a quick foray through this technical guidance note on measuring women's empowerment in the global health sector. And the intent is really, hopefully, that you can use this practically to be able to help to develop a plan for measuring women's empowerment in your global health sector work. So that's available in English and French online. I see they're posted there in the chat as well. And I'll just note, someone asked about what's gray literature. So gray literature is non-academic literature. So academic literature, of course, being anything that's published and peer-reviewed. Gray literature would be let's like a lot of documents in the note, for example, from Oxfam or from others. So that would be, the CARE or Oxfam or other NGOs or people who did not go through necessarily a formal peer review process. So it's a bit more difficult to find gray literature than it is to find academic literature, because there's a sort of a systematic way to identify academic literature. But the gray literature oftentimes has sometimes much more interesting things than academic literature, because it's really the practitioners on the ground who are talking about this. So even Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we've used some of their information in this note as well. So lots of different people like that. So thank you for that question. So I'm going to go now turn to the next guidance note that I'm going to be talking about. I know I'm supposed to be answering questions later in the chat, but the problem is that we also talked earlier about if anyone talks too fast, to look in the chat. So I have to look in the chat to make sure I'm not talking too fast, and so then I see a question. So hopefully my French interpreter is happy with my slow speaking. I'm hoping. In my head it sounds slower than it probably is. So the next guidance note I want to talk about is the guidance note on developing monitoring and evaluation plans for global health and rights programs. So as Erica mentioned, this was literally hot off the press Friday. In fact, when I was writing my notes, I didn't have all the page numbers because I had an earlier version before the final version. So this is very hot off the press, but also available. You'll see in the chat, the links are there as well. And this note was developed also in consultation with Global Affairs Canada and with CanWaCH Metrics Working Group. And we had lots of great feedback from various NGOs, non-governmental organizations on this guidance. But one major challenge, again, was, as I mentioned at the start, that people have different levels of experience with different areas. So for example, you'll see we have a section on sampling in this note, and some people wanted much more detail on sampling, very specific questions. Whereas other people are like, what's sampling? So, we really have a very, very big range of people who are accessing these types of guidance notes. So we really wanted to keep this short and succinct, but also be helpful, hopefully, for a wide range of people. There was also lots of comments on challenges faced when working on a performance measurement framework and baselines and the various timing of those components, and including when a monitoring and evaluation plan should be finalized. So we tried to incorporate as much information as we could, recognizing that this guidance note really can't be all things to all people. I'll try not to use too many acronyms, but once in a while I may use M&E for monitoring and evaluation, just because I have to say it so much. So if I do say that, then that's what I'm meaning by M&E, is monitoring and evaluation. So I'm going to head down here first to the purpose of the guidance note. So you'll see it's sort of a similar format to the last one as well. But the purpose of this guidance note is to really provide, hopefully, very clear and short guidance for monitoring and evaluation plan development around global health and rights programs. So it includes considerations, information, and lots of different resources and references to hopefully help you do this and to be able to develop a results-based M&E plan for your projects in a way that's consistent with best practices. So it's assumed that the reader has some understanding of monitoring and evaluation. You wouldn't be able to read this sort of as your first document, perhaps, but there are other resources included here if you're showing this, for example, to someone new on your team who's new to monitoring and evaluation and you want them to learn more. There's lots of resources, hopefully, that will be helpful. And the audience for this includes civil society organizations, academic institutions, or other organizations who are doing global health programming, whether they're receiving global affairs funding, but also hopefully with other kinds of funding as well. And also, I think the intent is you can also use this with your Global Affairs Canada project team leaders where applicable as well, to be able to point to this and say, well, this is what we're trying to get at here as part of our plan, for example. So the note really starts by outlining the purpose of an M&E plan. And, I find that when we're starting out on a new project, we often get focused on checking off the box of what the funder is asking for. Yeah, I've done my M&E plan. I've done my monitoring and evaluation plan. But we sometimes forget why that plan is so important. even if it wasn't a requirement. But in many cases, it is a requirement, of course. But the M&E plan really helps to understand which aspects of the project are working and which are not, make course corrections as we might need, to be able to share lessons learned, to identify achievements, to ensure accountability, to build feedback loops with stakeholders, and also to plan future projects. So they really are living documents, but they also need to be detailed enough that they're useful. They should be a hands-on resource. For example, you have a new team member coming on board, that they would be able to understand the plan, or if you have turnover, for example. So really it should be updated at regular intervals, and can be a living document. So you'll see also in the purple fonts here, while we don't get into details about, for example, how to do a logic model, performance measurement framework, or an implementation plan, there's guidance here that will link you to other guidance that can help. So continuing with this section, this outlines the details of what should be included in an M&E plan as well. And we consulted with many people, and many people said to us, I can't do this kind of level of detail at this point. Why do I need to do this kind of level of detail if I'm still developing my performance measurement framework, et cetera? But I've been a consultant now for almost 15 years, and we do a lot of inception reports for clients. I do a lot of baseline, midline, endline, all sorts of evaluations, process, formative, et cetera. And you can't budget for a consultant, for example, until you've done this kind of planning. You need to figure out who do you need to talk to get this data? What data is available? All of this is important early on. So you'll see that that's a common theme throughout the note, that it's really the planning and the justification that's key. So things may change and evolve, but you want to really identify what you know, what the plan is, and provide those details as a starting point, and continue to work through those to be able to have as detailed a plan as possible. So we've also included, as we've gone along, you'll see here at the bottom of page 6, more resources for people who are less familiar with monitoring and evaluation, for example, to give them a bit more support as well. And then we get into the detailed guidance, and there's a list of the global affairs guidance that people may need to, you need to ensure you're familiar with for sure if you're doing a global affairs funded project, and these identify these. And then it gets into we also have a definition of monitoring and evaluation for people who may not be familiar with some of those common terms. And then we get into developing evaluation questions. And you'll see in these various categories that we're covering, there's always these bulleted lists of basically considerations or questions that you should ask yourself. So I'm hoping these are, they're written to be helpful, even if you are an expert in this area, even if you've done lots of global affairs projects, even if you've done lots of various projects, just to get you thinking about these things. So this gets people to think about some of the criteria around strong evaluation questions. You'll see the same thing under design methods and tools around formulating indicators, some of the things you may want to consider in your formulating indicators. There's also a template around building a performance measurement framework. So we've built in templates throughout from other sources. And also always referring to global affairs, different guidance. And then some, for example, existing indicators, and these came up in some of our consultations with different NGOs. So some indicators that you may want to go and take a look at elsewhere that might be helpful for you. And again, oftentimes linking right back to global affairs and what some of their tip sheets, in this case around indicators, but they've got various tip sheets. This is sometimes hard to find. So hopefully this guidance note gives you an easy way to find some of these other resources from Global Affairs Canada. Then we get into determining data sources, collection methods, and frequency, as well as responsibility. And again, different resources that you can connect with. And then under the tool description, again, the hope is not to just say, we're going to do a survey. Well, what kind of survey? What's the purpose of the tool? What indicators will you be measuring? How will you disaggregate the data? What's your sampling for each tool? So just some bullets to be able to think through, how do I do a more detailed description of each of the areas that I'm going to be focusing on in terms of tools. There's a section also on secondary data, including health management information system, as well as demographic and health survey, and UNICEF's multiple indicator cluster survey and the service provision assessment. So people who may not be familiar with other sources of secondary data, there's some sources there for you. And then some key questions to consider around secondary sources, such as the recency of the data, what are the quality issues, and many people are experts in this area. So if you're experts in this area, this won't be the area for you, but hopefully for people who are less familiar, want to be able to find out, where can I find out more about secondary data? Where could I locate some of this? Then there's a section on sampling, and we know that sampling is critical. And as I mentioned earlier, many people think that sampling can be done later on or in the process or not at the start, but this needs to be thought early in the process, and a rationale identified for this. We talked a lot with Global Affairs Canada about the importance of rationales for areas, and whatever you're developing in terms of your M&E plan, to be able to provide the rationale and say, this is why we're doing it this way. This is why we're, for example, using this sampling. We're getting the sampling frame from this place, and this is why. So there's also a number of resources available around sampling as well for people who may want more information on that, so that people could get into more detail as well. So for example, on lot quality assurance sampling, if you don't need to worry about that, you don't need to worry, but if you want more information, there's more information on that, for example. Defining targets, lots of information here on defining targets, because people also said to us, we shouldn't have to define targets until we have our baseline data, but oftentimes people are being asked to define targets before that. How do you do that? So we've given some suggestions on how you might do that, using secondary data or using your previous experience, using research, using participatory approaches with your groups to find out what do you know already, and to be able to, again, provide the rationale for your targets. So we've provided hopefully some considerations there for you in terms of use around targeting. And again, also always linking back to the global affairs resources as well. So you can always link back to that if you're doing a global affairs project too. Again, more questions, this category under data collection, but more bulleted questions for you to consider and think about when you're doing your data collection. I have a list like this this is how I base this list on, is a list that I use when I'm working for clients. It's easy to forget some of these things, so it's just helpful, I think, to have that list there. So hopefully it's helpful for you to be, oh yeah, I know I have to do this and I would remember this, but let's remember this early on, so we can think about some of the practical and logistical considerations, for example, in terms of data collection and how we're going to work through that. Then we have a section on logistics, data management, and flow, and some key questions you want to ask in that area. And also around analysis, you want to have an analysis plan for each indicator and each tool, and want to be thinking through who's going to conduct it, what software are you going to use, how is data going to be coded. So again, thinking through some of these details, people will say, well, it's so early in the process, but if you think through these now as you're developing your monitoring and evaluation plan, it will certainly save you lots of time and effort later on as well, and it'll help you with your budgeting too. We also have a similar section around reporting, and there's a link with the GAC's RBM guide around reporting on outcomes. And then there's a baseline data and report, because we heard that the baseline is also a challenge for many people, and thinking about that early on. So we've got a bit of a summary in terms of some of the headings you're going to want to include and what you're going to want to include as part of your baseline as well. There's a section on budget that gets into, again, some things you want to consider around budget. And many of you have done many of these and are experts in this, but others may think, oh, have I covered everything? You might forget about pilot testing, for example. Oh yeah, that costs some money there, for example. So hopefully a list that will help you in thinking through your budget. And then, of course, learning plans, data sharing, and use. So the importance of only collecting data really that you're going to be learning from, that you'll be using, and some key questions around how you want to be able to think through your learning plan. Then we get into some important principles and considerations. COVID-19, not a surprise to any of us, I don't think, and you guys have all been doing evaluations, I think a lot of people during COVID-19, but just some considerations around COVID-19 and some resources too, and a recorded webinar from CanWaCH too, so that you can help you think through some of those issues as we continue on with challenges around COVID. And a larger section here around ethical considerations. CanWaCH will know I'm always beating the ethical consideration drum because it's such an important area. I've been through ethics in, I think, about 14 countries now. We oftentimes think we don't need formal ethical approval. In fact, many countries such as Tanzania require them, and they also require a data transfer plan if you send any data, for example, back to Canada. And I think if we really want to be focusing on decolonization and participatory approaches and such, we really need to look at this more. So I've included a list of WHO ethics committees so that you can look at this in more detail, but also considerations that you may want to think about in terms of ethical considerations and whether or not we're doing enough in this area. So there's some information there that hopefully is helpful, and references to others as well. There's a section on risks and mitigation responses. Again, I think this is an area in our reports that we oftentimes just, let's just fill out a table. Yeah, there's these usual risks. I'll just copy and paste from my previous one that I did. But really, it's really an important time to be able to think of what really are my risks and how might I go about mitigating those. And this can be really important, I think, to your planning. And there's some links there from Global Affairs Canada that can help you with those tables as well. And then some thoughts around how do you assess your capacity within your team for monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and a reference there too from Better Evaluation. And then some more information on feminist meal, which you can also, feminist monitoring, evaluation, and learning, which you can also refer back to the other technical guidance note. A little bit on anti-racism and decolonization. I won't pretend that this is giving it enough justice. This could be whole books. Well, there are lots and lots of books on this, but just again to flag this and to have more resources for people to consider this as part of your process as well. And same with intersectionality and population considerations. And this matters too for your analysis plan and your disaggregation of your data, et cetera. So these are other considerations, as well as community-driven approaches and taking a participatory approach. And there's some resources both from CanWaCH and also from a lot of CanWaCH partners, including Salanga, there for people to be able to look at some of the latest thinking around participatory approaches and community-driven approaches. And just like with the women's empowerment, there's a detailed guidance checklist that goes through the various areas for consideration for you to think through as well. I won't get into that into any more detail because I know I'm running out of time here. And then there's some additional tools in the back around coverage survey tools, impact modeling, quality of care tools, one of the links on meal design, and CanWaCH resources for people who may want more detail to help them. And then a long list of resources that hopefully will help in terms of developing your M&E plan as well. So again, the hope with this plan is to really be able to hopefully help people to develop a useful and practical M&E plan and to hopefully provide helpful information and details and helpful reminders for people who may already know all this inside and out, but hopefully will be still helpful for those as well. So I will look at the chat after I pass this over and answer any questions via the chat, but I'm going to pass this now over to Dominique and Geneviève, and thank you so much.
So hello, everyone. Thank you very much for your participation to this CanWaCH Academy. I'm called Dominique. I work there, and I'll make my presentation with Geneviève. So there's really the both of us who are really happy to present a tool that we've been working on for many months already with the Francophone collection or group for CanWaCH. And this Francophone group is made up of many Francophone people that work in equality in Canada that are connected from afar or close on gender equality at CanWaCH. So the tool that Geneviève and I are going we are going to present, it's in its last development phase, and it should be launched within the next few weeks. So unfortunately, today we cannot present the tool. It would be just a Word document with great many documents. So it wouldn't be very interesting visually, but we are truly in the last phase, and we're hoping to launch it in the next few weeks. As Erica was saying, watch your email box. There will be an announcement in a newsletter from the CanWaCH in the next few weeks or months. So that tool, what is it? Well, it's a terminology guide on the use of the technical terms in terms of gender equality, which is destined to those people in the international development field. So before I talk a bit more about what this guide is and what makes it different from the other guides, I want to explain where it comes from. So this idea of creating this guide came last week when the CanWaCH was working on the French translation of what they prepared on gender equality that was prepared in 2020. So at the translation time into French, a colleague, non-Francophone from the CanWaCH, asked my opinion on a few terms that had been selected by the translation team. And that colleague was somewhat surprised and amused to see how surprised I was with some of the technical translations that were recommended, because I somewhat disagreed with some of those. So what I explained at the time is that to work in French in gender equality is sometimes complex because there are many technical terms used in the Francophone environments that are often incorrect and not updated and um, often are debated. And so it's after this conversation that the idea came to create a terminology guide on the use of technical terminology in gender equality in French. So I'm sure that many of you are wondering. There's already many other ones that are similar. How is it different? Well, there's some other lexicon on gender equalities within many international institutions. I'm thinking of Gender Term, which is the online lexicon which has tens and tens of terms linked to gender equality. And this is all in a data bank. And it proposes French, English, and Spanish translations. However, many of those terms, including the Only Femme tool, sometimes the translations are incorrect, erroneous, or not up to date. So it's to react to these challenges that we wanted to create this tool. And one example that we work at, well, of course, we went and examined all of that was available, and the term women's agency, which is the uh, action power to act of women, that was translated by women's organization, which does not really make any sense in French, and which is the literal translation of women's organization. So although there are many available resources, they're not always exact. So it's really one of the reasons that got us to work on this terminology guide. So this guide is different because we truly work to recommend some terms more than others, to correct some of the mistakes that exist in other documents. But what's truly different in what we did is that we wanted to give some recommended terms, but also explain why these terms in French are more correct than others and why some of the terms must be avoided, so that those people consulting the tool will understand the reasons why we recommend and correct some of the technical terms. So for instance, in the guide, we'll explain that the term gender equality, égalité des sexes, is to be avoided because it refers to the sex of rather than the social term. And so this is the type of thing that we analyze in our terms. So to summarize our approach, we truly did that for the Canadian Organization of the International Development Sector that work in French. And we want the organizations to be exposed to this debate and truly be able to reflect on the organizations that they want to make in terms of gender equality, but also to reflect on the implication of the use of these terms. So that's one of our terms. And we're also hoping that this guide is going to perhaps influence some of the sector or standardize the use of the terms linked to gender equality, and still raising some debates on the use of these terms, which debates are welcome. So I'll now take a few minutes to quickly explain what this guide looks like and how we created it. So just before I do this, I wanted to quickly recognize the participation of the people that were involved, because not anybody really had time on the at the table, but people were passionate about it, and so they were involved personally. So there was Genevieve from Canada, who will talk to the 3 minutes. Tina, Erica, and Erica with a K, Melody, formerly from CanWaCH, and Rafa from Red Cross, Julie from World Farm, and Catherine from CUSO. So thank you to all of the team. So what we did to create this guide at the outset is we created a very long list in terms of gender equality that was currently being used in English. So we really went from English, because it's often the issue that we are facing. Sometimes we work in English, we think in English, we're not certain of the translation. So we really started with a long list of terms in English, and then we added up all the French translations for those terms that were included in our list. And so we consulted many resources, the Terminology Bank for Women from Canada, the international resources, local academic resources. So we examined everywhere to see who used what in terms of terminology. And honestly, it was really interesting and an exercise, because we saw the diversity of translations that were available for the terms. Some of them could have up to 7 or 8 different translations in French of one same English word. So you can imagine the confusion that it can create as to the best possible use of the French term. So once we got all of the English terms and all the possible translations in French, what we did is we debated for each term which one would be best, or is there one better one that's not being used, but that would be more appropriate to be used in the feminist environment, but not necessarily in the literature. So truly held very interesting debates and exchanges as to obtain a consensus on each term and to find the best appropriate term based on the criteria of making sure that we had the right translation, significance, and all the technical aspects of the term. So we did that together. For some of the terms, it was very easy. We reached a consensus very easily. For others, it was a bit more complex. So once we reached a consensus on all these terms, we included that in a document which will be shared with you in the weeks to come. So it's a big terminology chart with some column of English term, one term to privilege, another one to avoid, and the most interesting, which is the explanation and justification why a given term is better than another, what justifies our decision. And so it's the tool that we are very eager to present. And I'll give the floor to Genevieve, who will talk more in depth of how we came about to select the best possible term, because as I said, it's not always obvious to reach a consensus. So I give you the floor. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dominique. You can all hear me properly? Yes? So indeed, as Dominique was explaining, there was first a process of reviewing what was written already. And then we went to a step of meeting, exchanging, debating, discussing. And indeed, the objective was to truly ponder over those elements that deserve more precision, or like, for instance, children's marriages is still broadly used, especially with the sliding of the language because it's shorter and different than from other guides. We said that the terms of marriage of children, the early marriages of children that are forced. Then we explained that, yes, the term is longer, but it's a better term than the others because it's an umbrella term that allows to better reflect the diversity of the situation.
Nous avons également eu à échanger sur des termes qui ne font pas consensus. Je vais revenir là-dessus un peu plus tard. Donc, ce guide se veut réellement une co-construction sur la base des évolutions dans notre secteur lorsqu'il s'agit de conceptualiser l'égalité des genres et les termes reliés, sur les éléments de langage préconisés par nos organisations respectives et leurs partenaires et sur la base de nos expériences. Le collectif comprend également des personnes œuvrant dans le domaine de la traduction. Donc ça nous a aussi vraiment permis de prendre en compte les recommandations de structures telles que l'Office québécois de la langue française, par exemple. Les utilisateurs et les utilisatrices du guide verront que nous proposons parfois d'autres choix que ceux privilégiés par nos partenaires clés. Cependant, il est important de se rappeler que le guide ne se veut pas prescriptif. Le collectif explique ses choix sur la terminologie proposée, mais nous reconnaissons d'emblée que les termes évoluent, que les usages privilégiés peuvent différer d'un continent, d'une région à l'autre. Par exemple, Dominique expliquait le terme égalité des genres dans le guide, dans la pratique, dans le secteur de la coopération internationale en français. Il est reconnu d'emblée qu'il y a une différence entre les concepts de sexe et de genre. Mais par contre, égalité entre les sexes dans les documents en français est encore largement utilisée. Donc, le collectif reconnaît que certains termes sont toujours en usage parce qu'ils figurent dans nos documents de politique, dans des résolutions et qu'il peut être parfois difficile ou risqué de les changer. D'autres termes comme agentivité, qui est utilisé pour traduire agency, est largement utilisé au Québec, mais moins ailleurs dans la francophonie. Et finalement, un terme comme empowerment est plutôt en français utilisé en anglais parce qu'il y a peu de termes en français qui nous permettent de capter, je dirais, la racine visible, le power, qui est reflété dans le terme en anglais. Mais il y a des propositions dans le guide. Donc, le collectif reconnaît que ces éléments de langage, ces vocables, peuvent être très contextuels et alors le guide se veut véritablement une invitation à la discussion. Le guide, vous verrez également, présente ce que nous avons appelé des choix militants. Donc, nous proposons aussi des termes qui ne sont pas nécessairement largement utilisés par nos organisations respectives, comme le premier choix de traduction. Par exemple, le terme « female genital mutilation », cutting, a donné lieu à un échange vraiment intéressant. Bien qu'en anglais, l'usage de « female genital cutting » soit de plus en plus courant, par exemple, la Société des obstétriciens et gynécologues du Canada préconise l'usage de ce terme, en français, force est de constater que, de manière générale, on utilise encore mutilation génitale féminine ou excision au sens plus large pour représenter l'ensemble des différents types d'interventions. Ce terme ne fait définitivement pas consensus. D'une part, par les militantes qui ne souhaitent pas que l'impact bien réel de ce geste soit en quelque part neutralisé. Et d'autre part, par les survivantes qui ne veulent pas nécessairement être perçues comme des victimes. Donc, ce processus initial de traduction de l'anglais au français nous a aussi amené à réfléchir, nous a interpellés, en fait, aussi à réfléchir au poids des mots, au fait que l'utilisation de termes techniques permet parfois difficilement de réconcilier, si je peux dire, un terme plus technique à une réalité très violente de déni des droits et que, ultimement, les personnes directement concernées utiliseront le terme auquel elles s'identifient le plus. Donc, certaines survivantes vont parler de mutilation, d'autres non. Et ça, ce n'est pas nécessairement à nos organisations d'opérationnaliser des choix là-dessus. Donc, comme je disais, l'exercice nous amène alors à réévaluer plus largement l'apparente objectivité des termes et du langage, et ce, aussi bien en français qu'en anglais. Empowerment en anglais est un autre exemple. Ce terme est critiqué depuis longtemps, bien qu'encore utilisé partout. Donc, la présente discussion aujourd'hui, nous l'espérons, participera vraiment à ouvrir cet espace de discussion dans le secteur de la coopération canadienne. Quelles seront les prochaines étapes? Donc, comme le disait Dominique, le guide sera lancé dans les prochaines semaines en ligne sur le site du CanSFE. La proposition du collectif est un document vivant. C'est réellement un processus qui se veut itératif et nous aimerions grandement recevoir vos commentaires, vos suggestions et voire même des nouveaux termes à ajouter au guide. Et finalement, de notre part, à Dominique, à moi, ainsi que de la part du collectif, nous vous remercions grandement pour ce moment d'écoute et, je l'espère, d'échange aujourd'hui. Et nous avons vraiment hâte de vous lire et d'échanger avec vous. Et maintenant, je vais passer la parole à Erika et Dominique et moi allons voir s'il y a des questions dans l'espace de conversation. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Genevieve and Dominique and Elizabeth for sharing. I know we are tight on time, so I'm just going to kind of dive right in here on the Beyond the Binary guidance note and how this document came to be, and just give you a small glimpse into what the document looks like. And I really encourage you on your own end to be able to peruse it and look through all the practical resources. It's over 70 pages worth, so there is a lot to read. So just as a starting place, before the toolkit came to be, what we heard from the Gender Equality Working Group and our members is that as a sector, we can better equip ourselves with the appropriate language, tools, and skills to start to identify opportunities to open up space for a more inclusive understanding of the diversity of gender expression and experience across communities around the world. Gender expression and experience that exists beyond the heterosexual binary model. In particular, there was a voiced interest and desire among gender and health development practitioners to, number one, increase our understanding of non-binary gender frameworks for engaging in gender and health programming. Number two, to identify associated tools and best practices to help us engage in gender identity discussions, programming, and monitoring and evaluation. And number three, to look for entry points for greater inclusivity in global health and gender equality programming. So bring us to early 2021, when CanWaCH worked with the Gender Equality Working Group and the author of this guidance note, Andrew Park, to respond to these voice needs of our membership. And herein comes the toolkit. So this toolkit was developed for CanWaCH partners and other organizations who are seeking to include LGBTI people in development activities. There are three parts to this document. So if you access the links that were shared in the chat, you'll be able to open it up. And if you check out the table of contents, you'll be able to see the wide range that this guidance document covers. But to just quickly highlight it, part one of the guidance note sets out basic information about sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics, how they are defined, how they can be assessed when collecting data about LGBTI people. Additionally, this section provides a brief summary of current empirical knowledge about the size of LGBTI populations. Part 2 examines the impact of social and structural stigma on the mental and physical health of LGBTI people. Additionally, this section reviews sexual and reproductive health and needs of sexual minority women and transgender people. And lastly, part 3 focuses on the benefits of engaging local LGBTI communities and suggests how to identify and safely reach out to LGBTI civil society organizations. It also includes measures on non-LGBTI civil society organizations and the measures they can take to ensure their activities are inclusive and responsive to the needs of LGBTI people. There's also 3 appendices that are really useful and practical tools that are included within this guidance note that are really can be very beneficial to your work if you have time to check them out. Appendix 1 is just a glossary of terms that are used throughout the document. So that's a helpful reference tool as you read through. Appendix 2 is particularly helpful as it is a style and usage guide to grammar and usage of pronouns, various forms of the abbreviation of LGBTI, and terms such as transgender and intersex. This guide is useful for writing reports, proposals, and correspondence. And as well, it includes recommendations for the use of terms related to sexuality and gender in international settings. And lastly, the third appendix lists selected reports and toolkits and mapping documents related to specific areas of programming. The list is exhaustive, but just a couple examples is you can look for resources under humanitarian settings, under sexual and reproductive health rights, under data collection, intimate partner violence, etc. So please do check that out, and you can find the guide on our website again, along with a webinar recording from May 2021, where our author of this guidance note talks a little bit more about it and some other fascinating information. As we are right on the hour, I'm just going to quickly wrap up and say huge thanks to Elizabeth, Dominique, and Jean-Pierre for sharing your time and brilliance with us today. We're all leaving this session with new knowledge and resources in our pockets. So that's really exciting, and huge thanks to those who took an hour out of their busy day today to tune in and join our team as we talk through the key resources. We really hope you found this session useful, and we'll definitely be following up with the recorded accompanied resources and of course any answers to questions that were in the chat. So wishing everyone a wonderful afternoon, and thanks again.